Right now, I'm in my recipe meta box that we created previously. In the previous lecture, you downloaded the assets folder. Inside that folder, you'll find another folder called extras. Look for the file named recipeoptions.txt. Open up the file and paste everything into this meta box. There's nothing special going on here. This is just Bootstrap markup. There is no JavaScript or PHP code being specified to these forms. A lot of this markup is to just make our fields look organized. There are two things I want you to notice though. There is no form tag. Actually, this whole page is wrapped in a form. I'm going to inspect this element and you'll see that WordPress wraps all this UI with a form tag. Notice how Chrome highlights everything encompassed by the form tag, so we don't have to create another form inside this meta box. The second thing I want you to notice are the name attributes for each input field. I prefixed each name with r_ because WordPress would generate a lot of fields for custom post types. So we want our fields to stand out. It's important you give each field a name, as the fields will be submitted with these names as the post keys. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. I'm going to fill in some of these fields really quick. Feel free to follow along and fill in these fields with whatever values you like. We're not really worried about the values right now. Alright, so I decided to make a recipe for a cake. For the content area, I'm going to use something called Lorem Ipsum. Lorem Ipsum is a really handy tool that will help you generate content. I'm going to set this to 2 paragraphs and generate some content. Copy and paste this into the text editor. This tool is really great so that you don't have to type in gibberish or write actual content. It's dummy content. I'll provide a link to it in the resource section of this lecture. Next, I'm going to add some tags and categories. These can be completely random as well. Lastly, fill out the rest of the fields. Nothing really special. Feel free to fill in these fields however you like. Just make sure you fill out the recipe fields. Don't submit this post just yet. We have to create the logic for processing and saving the input. Inside the index file, let's add the action hook, save post. This hook is triggered when a post is saved. Of course, we only want to use this hook if the post is a recipe post. In the resource section of this lecture, I provide a link to the save post hook. WordPress talks more about this hook, but we want to concern ourselves with the custom post type example. WordPress provides an example for how we should go about making sure we only save data for a specific post type rather than a generic post or random post type. However, if you scroll down even further, you'll notice this note that says, as of WordPress 3.7, an alternative action has been introduced, which is called for specific post types. Save post, post type. Hooking to this action, you wouldn't have to check on the post type in the sample above. To make sure we only process recipe posts, we'll add _recipe to the hook name. Just like that, this hook will only be triggered for recipe post. The function we want to call is r_savePostAdmin. For this part of the lecture, we're actually going to use the 2 extra parameters that are optional for the add action function. The third parameter is priority. There is a possibility that other plugins might use this hook. The order of execution is determined by this third parameter. If this is set to 1, then this function will fire first before all others. If set to a higher number, then our function will fire last. The default priority is 10. We're going to leave this at 10. The fourth parameter is what we really want to set. This parameter allows us to define how many arguments are sent to the function. What does this actually mean? Well, action hooks can actually provide our functions with extra information about the action currently happening. Not every action provides this, but the save post hook does. By default, this value is always 1. However, the save post hook provides 3 arguments. So set this to 3. The only way to find out if an action hook provides extra arguments is by checking the WordPress documentation. At this point, I want you to create a folder called Process. I like to create a folder for functions and classes that process data. This folder will contain all files related to updating, deleting, and creating data. Once again, this is not required by WordPress. This is just a way I prefer to keep things organized. Create a file called savepost.php and define the function here. Make sure to include it from the index file. This function will be provided 3 arguments. The first is the post ID. The second is the post, which contains info about the post itself. The third is update. This variable is a Boolean value. It will let you know whether this is a new post or an old one being updated. Inside this function, I'm going to check if the update is false. If it is, I know this is a new post, and so therefore, I don't want to process anything, so I'm going to simply return this function. Next, I'm going to output the post variable and format it. Then I'm going to code the script. Let's submit the recipe post and see what we get. There's a lot being submitted, but we won't concern ourselves with most of this data. Most of this is handled by WordPress anyway. The data we want to take a look at is the data we inputted. It's our responsibility to process and save it. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see the 5 fields we created being submitted. You should see your input appear for each of them as well. Now that we confirmed our data is being sent, we can process it and save it. Remove this bit of code that outputs the array. I'm going to create an array called recipe data. Then I'm going to create a key called ingredients and set its value to the corresponding post value. I'm also going to sanitize this by using the sanitize text field function. In the resource section, I provide a link to the WordPress Validating Sanitized and Escaping User Data page documentation. This is a very important page you should read up on. This page goes over the various functions for sanitizing user input. We will be using these functions throughout the course to sanitize user input. For now, we're only going to use the sanitize text field function. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom, you'll see this piece of information that says, take a look through WP includes/formatting.php to see all of the sanitization and escaping functions WordPress has to offer. I highly suggest you do so after this lecture. You can even borrow some of these functions for your own non-WordPress projects if you ever had trouble with sanitizing data. Let's go back to the save post function. I'm going to do this for the rest of the fields. You should have something similar to what I have at this point. The last and final step is to attach this data to the post. WordPress provides a function called update post meta. There's another function called add post meta, but we're not going to use it. The update version will actually check if this data already exists. If it doesn't, then it'll create it for us. So, it's a kill 2 birds with 1 stone kind of scenario. I'll provide a link to this function in the resource section of this lecture. We're going to pass in 3 things. First is the post ID. Even though this is a new post, WordPress will be smart enough to provide us with the post ID that will be used. So let's pass in the post ID variable. Next is the name for the metadata. There can be multiple metadatas for one post. It's important that we pass in a unique key. I'm going to name it recipe data. Lastly, we pass in the value for our metadata. It's that simple. Let's resubmit our data, and the post will now be saved. Our fields don't contain the metadata though. Let's fix this. I'm back inside my meta box. At the top of the function, I'm going to create a variable called recipe data and assign its value to the value returned by the getPostMeta function. This function has 3 parameters which we want to set. The first parameter is the ID of the post. So how do we get the post ID from a meta box? Actually, WordPress provides us with the post variable. Inside our function, we can accept it by adding post. This variable is an object which contains properties related to the current post. One of these properties is the ID. We can pass that in like so. The second parameter is the name of the metadata keys. We previously named this recipe data. The third parameter is kind of an odd one. The value returned can either be an array or single value. However, our data is already an array. Despite this, we're going to set this to true. This will now return a single value, which in our case is an array. 99% of the time, you'll want this to be true. This parameter is the most confusing, so just trust me and always set this to true. All we have to do now is set each of these field values to its corresponding value in the array. Refresh your page, and you should see your values being outputted. This should confirm that our data is being saved when we submit our post. Before I end this lecture, there's actually one more problem that we face. Try creating a new recipe. You'll see that we get these errors in the meta box. This is because our post metadata doesn't exist. So how do we solve this? It's simple. We just check if the values are empty and then create some default values. I'm going to use a conditional statement to check if the value is empty and just assign it some default values like so. Refresh your page now, and you should see the errors disappear. Before I end this lecture, I'm going to make one small modification to the savePost function. I'm going to add a rating and rating count key. Set both of these values to 0. We'll be needing these later. I'm going to update my post once, so I know that these 2 keys are saved with the post.